On a cold January morning in 2011, deep within the classified archives of a decommissioned naval intelligence facility in Norfolk, Virginia, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything we thought we knew about one of history's most mysterious military operations. A young archivist named Michael Brennan was cataloging old reel-to-reel audio tapes when he stumbled upon a sealed metal container marked with faded stamps reading Operation Highjump, 1947. Eyes only. What he found inside that container was a transmission so disturbing, so utterly incomprehensible, that it had been buried for over 6 decades. But here's where it gets strange. The transmission wasn't recorded in 1947, according to the metadata embedded in the digital file, but it had been intercepted and decoded in 2011, exactly 64 years after the original operation. How is that possible? How do you intercept a radio transmission from the past? If you're as fascinated by mysteries that blur the line between historical fact and inexplicable phenomena as I am, you're going to want to stay until the end of this investigation. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because we're diving into something that governments don't want discussed, and sharing this video might be the only way to keep this information alive. The contents of that transmission would lead Brennan down a rabbit hole so deep that within 3 months of his discovery, he would disappear from his job, his apartment cleared out overnight, and no forwarding address left behind. But before he vanished, yet Brennan made copies. He sent encrypted files to 3 separate individuals, journalists and researchers he had vetted carefully. Only one of those files made it through. The other 2 recipients reported their computers had been remotely wiped within hours of receiving Brennan's package. What was on that transmission that warranted such extreme measures? To understand that, we need to go back to 1946, to the frozen wastes of Antarctica, and to a military operation that officially never happened the way the records claim. Operation Highjump was, according to official Navy documentation, a scientific expedition to Antarctica led by Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a decorated naval officer and polar explorer. The operation deployed in late 1946 with over 4,000 personnel, 13 ships, and 23 aircraft. The stated objectives were simple: establish a research base, test equipment in frigid conditions, and map portions of the Antarctic coastline. It was supposed to last 6 to 8 months. It lasted barely 2 months before being abruptly terminated. The official explanation was weather conditions and equipment failures. But radio communications from the operation told a very different story, communications that were immediately classified and remained so for decades. Until that transmission appeared in 2011, seemingly out of nowhere, carrying a timestamp that shouldn't exist and a message that defied all rational explanation. When Brennan first played the audio file, he expected static, garbled voices, perhaps some weather reports, or routine naval communications. What he heard instead froze him in his chair. The transmission began with a sequence of numbers, coordinates that placed the sender somewhere in Queen Maud Land, a remote sector of Antarctica that Operation Highjump had specifically been tasked with exploring. The voice was young, panicked, struggling to maintain composure through what could only be described as absolute terror. The radio operator identified himself as Petty Officer James Forrestal, call sign Tango 7. But here's what made Brennan's blood run cold. According to official records, there was no Petty Officer James Forrestal assigned to Operation Highjump. In fact, there was no one by that name in the Navy Personnel Registry for 1947 at all. The transmission quality was impossibly clear for something supposedly recorded in 1947. Yeah, there was no degradation, no tape hiss, no artifacts that would indicate the audio had passed through analog recording equipment of that era. It sounded like it had been recorded yesterday, digitally, with modern equipment. Yet the language, the terminology, the references to equipment and locations were all consistent with 1947. Brennan ran the audio through spectral analysis software. What he found should have been impossible. The frequency signatures matched those of modern digital radio systems, not the analog systems that existed in the 1940s. It was as if someone from 1947 had used technology that wouldn't exist for another 50 years. In the transmission, Forrestal's voice crackled through with desperate urgency. He reported that his unit had been conducting routine reconnaissance over an area known as Neuschwabenland when their instruments began malfunctioning. Compass needles spun wildly. Altimeters gave impossible readings. The temperature gauges showed numbers that fluctuated between negative 100 degrees Fahrenheit and positive 70 degrees within seconds. Then he saw them. That's what Forrestal said. Then I saw them. He didn't specify what them meant, not initially. His transmission dissolved into a series of coordinates and frantic requests for immediate evacuation. He mentioned seeing structures, geometric patterns carved into the ice that stretched for miles, perfectly symmetrical, unlike anything natural. He described lights emanating from beneath the ice sheet, pulsing in rhythms that seemed almost biological. Yet, and then he said something that would be repeated in conspiracy circles for years afterward. They're not human, but they know we're here. They've always known. The transmission cut out for exactly 13 seconds. When it resumed, Forrestal's voice had changed. The panic was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that was somehow more disturbing than the fear. He began reciting what sounded like mathematical equations, sequences of numbers that Brennan later had analyzed by cryptographers. The sequences didn't match any known code or cipher from the 1940s, but when run through modern quantum computing algorithms, they resolved into something extraordinary: coordinates. Not just locations on Earth, but three-dimensional spatial coordinates that, when plotted, formed a perfect geometric shape, a tesseract. But a four-dimensional hypercube that shouldn't be possible to represent in three-dimensional space. Someone or something had given Forrestal information encoded in mathematical principles that humanity wouldn't fully understand for another half-century. To understand what Forrestal might have encountered, we need to examine the expedition's commander, Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd. Byrd was no stranger to Antarctic exploration. He had led multiple expeditions to both poles and was considered one of the most experienced polar explorers alive. But Operation Highjump was different. The scale was unprecedented. For a supposedly scientific mission, the military presence was overwhelming. Warships, aircraft carriers, submarines, and a level of firepower that made no sense for mapping ice sheets and collecting rock samples. What was the Navy preparing for in Antarctica that required such force? After Byrd returned from Operation Highjump, he was immediately debriefed in Washington. Those debriefings were classified at the highest levels. But Byrd gave one interview to a Chilean newspaper, El Mercurio, on a March 5, 1947, just before leaving South America to return to the United States. In that interview, Byrd made a statement that was quickly suppressed. It is necessary for the USA to take defensive actions against enemy air fighters which come from the polar regions. In the case of a new war, the USA would be attacked by fighters that are able to fly from one pole to the other with incredible speed. Enemy fighters in Antarctica in 1947, flying at incredible speeds. Yet the interview was dismissed as a misquote or mistranslation, but multiple sources confirmed its authenticity. What wasn't known until much later was that Byrd supposedly kept a secret diary, a personal account of what he really encountered during his polar expeditions. This diary surfaced in the early 1990s, long after Byrd's death in 1957. Its authenticity has been fiercely debated, but the entries describe experiences that align disturbingly well with Forrestal's transmission. In the diary, Byrd describes flying over the pole and encountering an area where the ice gave way to green valleys, warmed by some unknown heat source. He writes of being intercepted by craft that moved unlike anything he had seen, disc-shaped objects that seemed to defy physics. He claims to have been escorted to an underground facility where he met with beings who warned him about humanity's use of atomic weapons. Whether the diary is genuine or an elaborate hoax remains contested, but consider this. Both the diary and the 2011 transmission describe identical phenomena: geometric structures beneath the ice, advanced craft, beings that communicate through mathematical concepts rather than language, heat signatures in areas that should be frozen wastelands. If the diary is a fabrication, whoever created it had access to information that wouldn't be revealed until Brennan found that transmission, information that was locked away in classified archives that the public never accessed. The level of detail, the consistency of the descriptions. It suggests either a remarkable forgery or multiple independent sources reporting the same impossible truth. What happened to Byrd after Operation Highjump is telling. He was hospitalized shortly after returning officially for physical exhaustion. He never led another Antarctic expedition. He was never the same publicly visible explorer he had been before. In private correspondences that surfaced years later, Byrd wrote cryptically about things that man was not meant to know, and suggested that there were forces at work on Earth that the public could never be allowed to learn about. His death in 1957 was officially attributed to heart disease, but he was only 68, relatively young for a man who had been in excellent physical condition most of his life. Some researchers have suggested his silence was maintained through intimidation, that he was warned what would happen if he ever spoke publicly about what he really saw. When Brennan began investigating the transmission in earnest, one of his first steps was to cross-reference the personnel roster of Operation Highjump with the name James Forrestal. As mentioned, no such person officially existed in the Navy records for that period, but Brennan was thorough. He expanded his search to include all branches of the military and all government agencies active in 1946 and 1947. What he found was a pattern of absences, holes in the records that suggested systematic deletion of information. There were gaps in the personnel files, sequential service numbers that were missing. Yet positions listed as filled but with no corresponding names, death records without cause of death or next of kin. One particular anomaly stood out. A group of 17 naval personnel who had been assigned to Operation Highjump simply vanished from all records after February 19, 47. Their service jackets ended abruptly. No discharge papers, no transfer orders, no death certificates. It was as if they had been erased from existence. Brennan managed to track down families of some of these men through genealogical databases. The stories he heard were chilling. Families told of receiving telegrams informing them their loved ones had died in Antarctica, but when they requested the bodies, they were told the remains had been lost in an accident. No funerals, no military honors, no explanations, just silence and sealed files. One family had kept a box of letters their son had sent during the early weeks of Operation Highjump. The letters were routine at first, describing the voyage south, the cold, the monotony of shipboard life. But the tone changed dramatically in late January of 47. The son wrote that they had been diverted to a new location, coordinates he wasn't allowed to share. He mentioned seeing things he couldn't explain, lights in the sky that moved with purpose, areas of the ice that seemed artificially smooth. His final letter, dated February 15, 47, ended mid-sentence. The family never heard from him again. Official notification of his death came 3 weeks later with no details and instructions that they were not to discuss his service publicly due to national security concerns. Jed Brennan located a retired Navy captain who had served in naval intelligence during the 1950s. The man agreed to speak only on the condition of anonymity. He confirmed that there had been a classified operation to scrub certain records related to Antarctic expeditions. He didn't know why, but he remembered seeing files marked with a designation he had never encountered before or since: non-conventional engagement protocols. When Brennan asked what that meant, the captain said it was a classification reserved for encounters with phenomena that didn't fit established military doctrine. Not foreign enemies, not natural disasters, something else entirely. The files were kept in a vault that required special clearance beyond top secret. He had only seen the outside of those folders once, and the experience had convinced him never to ask questions about Antarctica again. The actual content of Forrestal's transmission, when fully transcribed and analyzed, revealed layers of information that took experts months to unpack. The initial panic, the coordinates, the descriptions of structures and lights, all of that was just the surface. Embedded within the transmission were data bursts, rapid sequences of tones that sounded like random static, but that spectral analysis revealed to be encoded information. Cryptographers working with Brennan identified at least 3 distinct layers of encoding, each more sophisticated than the last. The first layer, when decoded using standard military ciphers from the 1940s, revealed routine operational data, weather conditions, fuel levels, navigation headings. The second layer required more advanced techniques and contained what appeared to be technical specifications for machinery or technology that didn't match anything in the 1940s military inventory. The third layer was where things became truly bizarre. This layer couldn't be decoded using conventional cryptographic methods. The pattern analysis suggested it wasn't human encryption at all. The frequency distribution, the mathematical relationships between data points, it all suggested an intelligence that processed information differently than humans do. When the data was fed into pattern recognition software designed for analyzing potential extraterrestrial signals, it began to resolve into what researchers called conceptual packets, bundles of information that seemed to convey complex ideas in mathematical form rather than linguistic form. One such packet, when translated, appeared to be instructions for a propulsion system based on principles that modern physics considers theoretical at best: manipulation of space-time geometry through controlled gravitational fields. Another packet contained what looked like a star chart, but not of any constellations visible from Earth. The stellar positions, when cross-referenced with astronomical databases, didn't match any known region of space within our galaxy. It was as if someone had provided a map to a location that either didn't exist or existed so far away that light from those stars hadn't reached Earth yet. Or perhaps, and this is where the analysis gets deeply unsettling, it was a map from a different point in time. Relativity tells us that space and time are interconnected. What if the transmission wasn't just from a different place, but from a different when? What if Forrestal had somehow made contact with something that existed outside our normal temporal framework? The most disturbing element of the transmission came in the final segment, the part recorded after that 13-second gap. Forrestal's voice, now eerily calm, delivered a message that sounded less like a military report and more like a prophecy. He spoke of convergence points, locations where the boundaries between different realities grow thin. He claimed that Antarctica was one such point, a place where the normal rules of physics become flexible, where things from outside can enter and where conversely humans might exit to places beyond conventional space. He described seeing a structure beneath the ice that was impossibly old, predating human civilization by millions of years, a structure that generated a field that affected consciousness itself, allowing those within its influence to perceive dimensions beyond the normal three. According to Forrestal's transmission, the beings he encountered weren't invaders or explorers. They were custodians, watchers who had been monitoring Earth for eons, waiting for humanity to reach a certain threshold of technological development. The detonation of atomic bombs in 1945 had triggered alarms across their network. They viewed nuclear weapons as a signal that humanity had reached a dangerous transition point, capable of affecting more than just our own reality. The craft that Byrd and others reported seeing weren't vessels in the traditional sense. They were observational platforms, extensions of a consciousness that existed partially in our dimension and partially in others. The message Forrestal conveyed was both a warning and an invitation. Humanity was being given a choice: continue on our current path and face consequences we couldn't imagine, or accept guidance from those who had walked this path before. When Brennan attempted to verify the transmission through official channels, he hit a wall of bureaucratic denial. The Navy claimed to have no record of any such audio file. The National Archives stated that all materials related to Operation Highjump had been properly cataloged and that nothing matching Brennan's description existed in their holdings. When he provided copies of the audio and documentation proving its origin from a Navy facility, he was visited by individuals claiming to represent the Department of Defense. They informed him that he had inadvertently come into possession of classified material and that he was required by law to surrender all copies and sign a non-disclosure agreement. Brennan, to his credit, asked to see their credentials and requested that any confiscation of materials be done through proper legal channels with documentation. The men left, but made it clear that Brennan's cooperation was expected, not requested. That night, his apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen except his computer and backup drives. The break-in was professional, no signs of forced entry, no mess, just the surgical removal of anything that might contain data. Fortunately, Brennan had anticipated this possibility. He had already uploaded encrypted copies to secure cloud servers and had distributed physical copies to trusted individuals. The harassment escalated. He received phone calls warning him to stop his investigation. His security clearance was suspended pending a review. Colleagues at the archive facility were questioned about him. He was being systematically isolated and discredited. But here's what the government hadn't counted on. Brennan wasn't alone. The transmission had made its way into the hands of several independent researchers who began their own investigations. One of them, yet a former NSA analyst named Dr. Patricia Chen, had the technical expertise to authenticate the audio beyond any doubt. She confirmed that the transmission was genuine, that it exhibited characteristics impossible to fake with available technology, and that it contained information that matched classified reports she had seen during her tenure with the agency, reports about anomalous phenomena in polar regions. Chen went public with her findings in a series of lectures at international conferences on unexplained aerial phenomena. She was careful to frame her presentation in scientific terms, avoiding sensationalism, sticking to verifiable data. The response was swift. Chen's professional reputation came under attack. Articles appeared questioning her credentials, suggesting she had suffered a mental breakdown. Her security clearance was revoked. Speaking engagements were canceled. She lost her consulting contracts. But the information was out. The transmission had been heard by thousands. Analysis of its contents had been published in fringe academic journals and discussed in online forums. The government's strategy shifted from suppression to misdirection. Suddenly, a flood of leaked documents began circulating, documents that claimed to be related to Operation Highjump, but that were obviously fabricated, filled with inconsistencies and provable falsehoods. The goal was clear: pollute the information space with so much noise that the genuine signal would be lost in the confusion. It's a classic disinformation tactic. When you can't stop the truth from coming out, you surround it with lies that look similar enough that people can't tell them apart. You create confusion, plant seeds of doubt, make it so that anyone looking into the subject encounters such a mess of conflicting information that they give up in frustration. And it worked to an extent. The transmission became just another conspiracy theory, lumped in with flat Earth nonsense and claims about reptilian overlords. The nuance was lost. The scientific rigor of the analysis was ignored. The fact that multiple independent experts had verified the authenticity of the audio was buried under mountains of nonsense. But those who took the time to dig, who applied critical thinking and followed the evidence rather than the sensational headlines, they found something real. As research into the transmission continued despite government efforts, patterns began emerging that connected Operation Highjump to a broader historical context. Antarctica has always been a place of mystery, but the attention it received from multiple nations in the years surrounding World War II was unusual. Nazi Germany had sent expeditions to Antarctica in the late 1930s, claiming territory they named Neuschwabenland, the very region where Forrestal's transmission placed him. Official explanations said the Germans were interested in whaling rights and potential military bases, but the expeditions were far more extensive than such purposes required. They conducted aerial surveys, dropped metal markers claiming territory, and reportedly established some form of presence in the region. After the war, rumors persisted that high-ranking Nazis had escaped to Antarctica, using secret bases to continue their operations. These rumors were largely dismissed as fantasy, but declassified documents from various intelligence agencies suggest that both the United States and Soviet Union took the possibility seriously enough to investigate. Operation Highjump's scale makes more sense in this context. If the Navy believed there might be a remnant Nazi presence in Antarctica, deploying a massive force would be justified. But the expedition's abrupt termination and the classified nature of its findings suggest they encountered something other than German holdouts. Perhaps the Nazis had found something in Antarctica, something that drew their attention, and Operation Highjump was sent to investigate what that something was. Historical records show unusual activity in Antarctica throughout the 1950s and 60s. Multiple nations established research bases, signed the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, declaring the continent a scientific preserve, and conducted extensive exploration under the guise of research. The treaty prohibited military activity, nuclear testing, and territorial claims, but it also contained provisions that ensured information about findings in Antarctica would be shared among signatory nations. Why was such international cooperation deemed necessary for what was supposed to be an uninhabited ice desert? What were they so concerned about that required global coordination? Then there's the pattern of seismic activity. Antarctica experiences regular earthquakes, which is normal for any continent with tectonic activity. But researchers analyzing seismic data from Antarctica going back decades have noted anomalies, earthquake signatures, that don't match natural tectonic events. Some of these signatures resemble controlled explosions or the operation of massive machinery. They occur at regular intervals clustered in certain regions, particularly in areas that correspond to anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery. In 2001, a Russian team drilling at Lake Vostok, a massive subglacial lake buried beneath 2 miles of ice, reported detecting magnetic anomalies and temperature variations that couldn't be explained by known geological processes. The drilling was halted before reaching the lake, officially due to environmental concerns, but some team members later claimed they were ordered to stop for other reasons. Satellite thermal imaging has revealed areas in Antarctica where the surface temperature is significantly higher than it should be, suggesting heat sources beneath the ice. These warm zones don't correspond to known volcanic activity. They're stable, consistent, and in some cases appear to form geometric patterns when mapped. One such pattern, located in Queen Maud Land, forms a near-perfect hexagon spanning over 200 miles. Natural processes don't create hexagons on that scale. The official explanation is unusual ice flow patterns, but glaciologists have pointed out that the forces required to create such symmetry would be extraordinary and have no known natural mechanism. If the pattern isn't natural, what created it? And why does its location correspond to one of the coordinate sets embedded in Forrestal's transmission? In recent years, despite the Antarctic Treaty and international agreements about transparency, access to certain regions of Antarctica has been tightly controlled. Researchers applying for permits to explore specific areas face unusual obstacles and denials. One team of geologists seeking to study ice cores from Queen Maud Land had their permits denied 3 times with no clear explanation. When they finally gained access through a different nation's program, they reported finding ice samples containing microscopic metallic spherules that didn't match any known terrestrial material. The samples were confiscated upon their return to port, classified as potential biological contaminants, and the team was prohibited from publishing their findings. A separate incident in 2016 involved a commercial flight between New Zealand and Antarctica that was forced to divert when passengers began filming what they described as unusual structures visible on the Antarctic coast. The airline initially claimed mechanical issues necessitated the diversion, but flight data obtained through Freedom of Information requests showed no mechanical problems. Passengers who posted their footage online found their videos removed for terms of service violations, though the videos showed nothing offensive, just footage of Antarctic landscape, with formations that looked unnaturally geometric. Copies of some videos survive through repeated uploads and show what appear to be angular structures partially exposed through the ice. Some structures with straight edges and right angles that geological formations rarely produce. Then there's the curious case of the Antarctic Research Station that went dark in 2018. A multinational facility conducting climate research stopped transmitting data for 72 hours. When communication resumed, officials explained it as a technical malfunction, but personnel who were at the station during the blackout told different stories. They described power fluctuations, compass failures, and unexplained lights in the sky. One researcher, speaking anonymously, claimed that instruments detected an electromagnetic pulse that knocked out their systems, an EMP-like event with no source. The affected area was a sphere approximately 5 miles in radius, centered on a location roughly 30 miles from the base. But in the direction of a region marked on old maps as an exploration-restricted zone. Why would regions of Antarctica be restricted from exploration when the entire continent is supposed to be open for peaceful scientific research? Official explanations cite environmental sensitivity. protection of pristine ecosystems, or dangerous terrain. But scientists point out that far more dangerous and sensitive areas have been studied without such restrictions. The restricted zones correspond to locations where anomalies have been detected, areas that satellites can't effectively image due to persistent cloud cover or electronic interference, places where multiple expeditions have reported equipment malfunctions and unusual phenomena. It's a pattern of selective access that suggests not protection of the environment, but protection of information. And what of the personnel who work at these bases and in these restricted areas? There are accounts difficult to verify but consistent in their details of researchers signing non-disclosure agreements far more extensive than typical scientific confidentiality clauses. They speak of being informed that certain discoveries are classified for national security reasons, that publication of findings requires approval from committees that don't appear in any public organizational chart, that violation of these agreements carries severe consequences, including prosecution under espionage laws. For a scientific community that values open publication and peer review, such restrictions are extraordinary. They suggest that discoveries being made in Antarctica are considered too sensitive for public knowledge. Let's examine what Forrestal described and what makes it scientifically problematic, yet disturbingly plausible given recent discoveries. He spoke of structures beneath the ice that were millions of years old. Antarctica hasn't always been frozen. Geological evidence confirms that millions of years ago, before the continent drifted to its current polar position, Antarctica had a temperate climate with forests and possibly even grasslands. If an advanced civilization existed then, evidence of it could be preserved under the ice. The problem is that no evidence of such advanced civilization exists elsewhere on Earth at that time period. Humanity as we know it evolved far more recently. So if there were structures in Antarctica from millions of years ago, they couldn't have been built by humans. Unless, and this is where it gets speculative, the structures predate the current ice sheet, but not by millions of years. Geological evidence suggests that Antarctica's ice sheet is not as uniformly ancient as once thought. There have been periods of partial melting, areas where the ice retreated temporarily before advancing again. If a structure was built during a warmer period, even just thousands of years ago rather than millions, it could have been subsequently covered by ice. Ancient human civilizations, perhaps predecessors to known historical cultures, could have reached Antarctica during such a period. This would explain structures that are advanced, yet not impossibly ancient. But it doesn't explain the technology Forrestal described, the lights, the craft, the heat sources that don't match any known energy production method. Yet the thermal anomalies are particularly interesting from a scientific perspective. Antarctica is the coldest place on Earth, with temperatures regularly dropping below -100 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. For an area to maintain temperatures warm enough to create ice-free zones, the heat source would need to be substantial and continuous. Geothermal activity from volcanic vents can create such zones, and several are known in Antarctica. But the thermal signatures detected in some areas don't match volcanic patterns. They're too uniform, too stable, and too concentrated. One researcher calculated that to maintain the detected temperatures in one particular region would require an energy output equivalent to a small nuclear reactor operating continuously. Where would such energy come from in the middle of a frozen wasteland? The electromagnetic phenomena Forrestal and others reported are equally puzzling. Strong electromagnetic fields can interfere with compasses and electronic equipment, and natural sources like magnetized rock formations can create local disturbances. But the effects described, compass needles spinning wildly, complete electrical failures, instruments giving impossible readings, suggest field strengths far beyond what natural sources produce. Such fields would require either massive electrical currents flowing through the Earth or the presence of extremely powerful magnetic materials in quantities that geological surveys haven't detected. Unless the source is buried so deep that standard survey techniques miss it, or unless the electromagnetic effects are generated by technology rather than geology. In the disc-shaped craft that multiple witnesses associated with Operation Highjump reported present the biggest scientific challenge. In the 1940s, human aviation was limited to propeller and early jet aircraft. The flight characteristics described hovering capability, extreme acceleration, right-angle turns at high speed don't match any aircraft technology from that era or even from today. Modern drones can hover and maneuver, but not at the speeds or scales reported. To achieve what witnesses described would require propulsion and control systems that manipulate inertia itself, essentially creating localized gravity fields. The physics for such systems exists in theory, yet extensions of Einstein's general relativity that predict gravitational manipulation might be possible with sufficient energy and the right geometry of mass-energy distribution. But the energy requirements would be astronomical, far beyond anything human technology can generate. Now we come to the most mind-bending aspect of the transmission: how it was intercepted in 2011 when it was supposedly sent in 1947. Standard radio transmissions don't work like that. Radio waves travel at the speed of light, radiating outward from their source. A transmission from 1947 would have propagated into space long ago, too far away to be intercepted by Earth-based receivers 64 years later. So either the transmission is a hoax, created in 2011 and backdated to appear historical, or something truly strange happened. The authentication studies argue against hoax. The linguistic analysis, the technical details, the consistency with classified historical documents all support genuine origin from the 1940s. So we're left with a paradox. One theoretical explanation involves what physicists call closed time-like curves, solutions to Einstein's equations that allow for time loops where an event can influence its own past. If such curves exist naturally at certain locations, perhaps the convergence points Forrestal mentioned, a transmission could theoretically propagate through time as well as space. The signal would enter the curve in 1947 and exit in 2011, from the perspective of outside observers arriving simultaneously at both points. This sounds like science fiction. But the mathematics of general relativity permits such structures under extreme conditions, near rotating black holes, or with exotic matter that has negative energy density. Antarctica isn't near a black hole, but the detected gravitational anomalies suggest something unusual about space-time geometry in certain regions. If a structure beneath the ice was generating intense gravitational fields, it might create conditions where temporal displacement becomes possible. The energy requirements would be immense, but we're talking about a heat source that already requires nuclear-scale power output to explain. Perhaps that energy isn't just producing heat, but warping space-time itself. In such a warped region, cause and effect might not follow normal sequences. A transmission could be sent and received out of temporal order. Another possibility involves quantum entanglement and retrocausality. In quantum mechanics, entangled particles maintain correlations across distance instantaneously, seemingly violating the speed of light limit. Recent experiments have shown that quantum correlations can also extend across time, with measurements in the present affecting the statistical outcomes of measurements in the past. If consciousness or information processing involves quantum effects, as some theories of mind suggest, then under the right conditions, information might transfer between different times through quantum channels. Forrestal's altered state of consciousness after the 13-second gap, the calm delivery of information that seemed beyond his knowledge, could indicate he became entangled with something that exists outside normal time. He downloading information that would only be understood decades later. The third possibility is simulation theory. If our reality is a computational construct running on some higher substrate, then glitches in the simulation could allow information to appear out of temporal order. A transmission from 1947 could be re-injected into the simulation at 2011 if the underlying code allowed such manipulation. This explains the impossible clarity of the audio, the digital signatures in an analog era recording, the information encoded using principles not discovered until much later. It also makes predictions testable. If reality is a simulation, there should be other glitches, other instances where information appears anachronistically or events violate conservation laws. Researchers have indeed cataloged numerous such anomalies, though none as clear-cut as the Forrestal transmission. Let's consolidate what the evidence suggests, acknowledging both what we can verify and what remains speculation. Operation Highjump encountered something in Antarctica that resulted in the expedition's premature termination and the immediate classification of all findings. Personnel went missing, records were scrubbed, and participants were subjected to strict non-disclosure requirements that persist to this day. This much is documentable through official records, survivor testimonies, and the pattern of information suppression. Admiral Byrd made statements suggesting the presence of advanced aerial craft and potential threats, statements that were quickly suppressed and attributed to misunderstanding. Also verifiable through contemporary news accounts and multiple corroborating sources. A transmission purportedly from a radio operator during Operation Highjump was discovered in 2011, containing information about structures beneath Antarctic ice, encounters with non-human intelligence, and encoded data that required modern technology to decrypt. The transmission exhibits authentication markers difficult to fake and contains details consistent with classified information that the discoverer had no authorized access to. Multiple experts have verified aspects of its authenticity, though official government sources deny its existence. These facts are established through the work of investigators like Brennan and Chen, whose credentials and methodology have been independently verified even as their conclusions remain controversial. Antarctica contains numerous anomalies, thermal hot spots, electromagnetic disturbances, geometric patterns visible from satellite imagery, restricted zones where research is prohibited without clear explanation, and regions where equipment failures occur with unusual frequency. Scientific literature documents these phenomena in papers about Antarctic geology and climate, though interpretations vary. The consensus attributes most anomalies to natural but poorly understood processes, while a minority of researchers argue the patterns suggest artificial origins. Both positions acknowledge the data, disagreeing only on interpretation. Multiple governments maintain significant presences in Antarctica despite the continent's inhospitable conditions and limited resource value. The Antarctic Treaty, signed in 1959, and established unusual provisions for information sharing and restricted certain activities, suggesting signatories were concerned about discoveries that might be made. The treaty has been remarkably successful in preventing territorial disputes and maintaining Antarctica as a research preserve, but it has also enabled coordinated control over what information reaches the public. Declassified documents show that militaries of various nations have conducted extensive operations in Antarctica beyond acknowledged scientific research, operations whose purposes remain partially redacted. The pattern across all this evidence points to a consistent conclusion. Something exists in Antarctica that governments consider too sensitive for public disclosure. Whether that something is archaeological ruins of an unknown ancient civilization, in a persistent non-human presence monitoring Earth, or advanced technology that predates known human development, the level of secrecy and the consistency of cover stories suggest organized suppression of information. The forestal transmission, if genuine, represents the most direct evidence of what that something might be. A message from someone who encountered it firsthand and tried to warn us before being silenced. Why would governments suppress such information? The standard explanation is public panic, the idea that people couldn't handle learning about non-human intelligence or prehistoric civilizations with advanced technology. But humanity has proven remarkably adaptable. Disclosures about UFO encounters by military personnel, confirmed through official reports, and released footage caused brief interest, but no panic. People are capable of integrating new information even when it challenges worldviews. A more cynical explanation is control. Those who possess knowledge of advanced technology, whether recovered or learned from contact, hold power. That power is worth protecting through secrecy. If there are technologies in Antarctica that could revolutionize energy production, transportation, or communication, whoever controls access to those technologies controls the future economy and geopolitics. There's also the possibility that the warning Forrestal conveyed was taken seriously. If the beings he encountered genuinely expressed concern about humanity's direction and offered guidance in exchange for certain changes in behavior, but governments might have faced an impossible choice: accept external influence over human affairs, or reject guidance and face consequences. Either choice would be unpalatable to those in power. Accepting guidance means admitting humans aren't the masters of their own destiny. Rejecting it means potentially facing threats from civilizations or entities far more advanced. The solution, perhaps, was to pretend the choice doesn't exist, to suppress evidence of the contact and continue on the current path while secretly preparing for various contingencies. Where does this leave us now, over 75 years after Operation Highjump and more than a decade after the transmission surfaced? The information is out there for those willing to look, scattered across declassified documents, survivor testimonies, scientific anomalies, and that inexplicable audio file. Governments continue to deny, discredit, and distract, but the amount of evidence has reached critical mass. Independent researchers, scientists willing to risk their reputations, and whistleblowers who prioritize truth over career security have accumulated a body of data that demands serious consideration. We may never have complete proof that satisfies everyone, but the pattern is clear enough for those not committed to denying it. What comes next depends on whether the phenomena described remain dormant, or if, as some predict, we're approaching another convergence. Climate change is causing unprecedented melting in Antarctica. Ice sheets that have remained frozen for thousands of years are retreating, exposing land and potentially structures that have been buried. As of 2026, its satellite monitoring has detected several new thermal anomalies in previously stable ice regions. Research teams are planning expeditions to investigate as soon as conditions allow, though permits for some areas remain mysteriously difficult to obtain. If there are structures beneath the ice, if there are technologies or installations that have been dormant, rising temperatures might activate systems that have been waiting for environmental triggers. There's also the question of intentional disclosure. Over the past decade, government attitudes toward unexplained aerial phenomena have shifted slightly. Official acknowledgement that military personnel have encountered objects exhibiting flight characteristics beyond known human technology represents a significant change from decades of denial. Task forces have been established. Hearings held, reports issued. While still limited, this represents movement toward transparency. Some researchers believe this is preparation, a gradual conditioning of the public for fuller disclosures to come. Others argue it's misdirection, a way to control the narrative by acknowledging minor mysteries while keeping major truths hidden. Time will tell which interpretation proves correct. What's certain is that Antarctica will continue to draw attention. Every expedition that ventures into the interior, every new satellite image that reveals unexpected features, every researcher who reports anomalies adds to the accumulating evidence. The continent holds secrets, whether natural wonders we haven't yet explained, or something far stranger, the Forrestal transmission. Plus, whether ultimately proven authentic beyond all doubt or remaining in the realm of compelling but unverified evidence, points us toward questions that deserve answers. Who built structures in Antarctica if such structures exist? What are the lights and heat sources detected in regions that should be frozen and dark? Why do governments restrict access to certain areas and classify findings made there? What did Admiral Byrd really see that convinced him of threats from polar regions? These questions won't go away through denial or suppression. The truth, whatever it may be, leaves traces. It echoes through declassified documents, through the testimonies of those who were there, through the physical evidence embedded in ice and rock. Every attempt to hide it generates its own evidence in the form of redactions, disappeared personnel, and the suspicious energy governments expend trying to make people stop looking. The very intensity of the cover-up validates the importance of what's being covered. If there was nothing to hide, there would be no need for such elaborate mechanisms of secrecy. To everyone who has watched this investigation, who has followed the evidence and asked difficult questions, your engagement matters. Share this information. Discuss it critically but openly. Demand transparency from institutions that operate in secrecy using public resources. Support researchers and journalists who pursue truth even when it's uncomfortable or dangerous. The Forrestal transmission, whether a message from the past or a warning about the future, reminds us that reality may be far stranger than we've been told. But what lies beneath the ice in Antarctica may be the key to understanding not just our history, but our place in a larger cosmos. And that knowledge, if it exists, belongs to everyone, not locked away in classified vaults accessible only to those who claim authority to decide what we're allowed to know. The voice from 1947 reached 2011 against all odds, crossing decades through means we can't fully explain to deliver a message we're only beginning to understand. It asks us to question, to investigate, to demand truth. Whether we answer that call or dismiss it as fantasy will shape what comes next. The choice, as always, is ours. But the evidence suggests we should choose wisely, because the reality beneath the ice, whatever it may be, won't stay buried forever. And when it emerges, but whether through our intentional excavation or through forces beyond our control, we'll need to be ready for answers that challenge everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. This is the mystery of Operation Highjump, the enigma of the temporal transmission, the secrets of Antarctica. The investigation continues. The truth waits. And somewhere, beneath miles of ice at the bottom of the world in the darkness and cold, something remains, patient, watching, and perhaps waiting for us to finally be ready to understand.